We are looking at our little white sheets in our bulletin at Romans chapter 13. And there Paul writes to us, "And do this, understanding the present time, for the hour has already come for you to wake up from your slumber, because our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. The night is nearly over, the day is almost here. So let us put aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us behave decently, as in the daytime, not in carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and debauchery, not in dissension and jealousy, but rather clothe yourselves with the Lord Jesus Christ, and do not think about how to gratify the desires of the flesh." You know, when I was growing up as a kid, for some reason, I was always attracted to the performers of the bygone ages. So guys like Groucho Marx and W.C. Fields and Al Jolson, they were always folks that I sort of liked to imitate as a kid. In fact, I sort of had this little budding impressionist business going on. But no one did I probably do more impressions of as a kid than this old comic by the name of Eddie Lawrence. And he had this shtick that he called the Old Philosopher. And every once in a while on our local radio station, WNCO, they would play this shtick about this down-on-his-luck fellow with this quavery voice who always seems to look at the gloomier side of life. But then in the midst of this sort of sad sack story, suddenly he finds this inspiration. But rather than me telling you about it this morning, how about we pretend like we go back to the days of old radio? And I want you to close your eyes and for the next few moments pretend, just like I was when I was a kid, that you get to hear this shtick. Not see it, but hear it on the radio. So close your eyes and listen to the ruminations of the old philosopher.
Hiya, folks. You say you lost your job today. You say it's 4 a.m. and your kids ain't come home from school yet. You say your wife went out for a corned beef sandwich last weekend. The corned beef sandwich came back, but he didn't. You say your furniture's out all over the sidewalk because you can't pay the rent, and you got chapped lips and paper cuts, and your feet's all swollen up and blistered from pounding the pavement looking for work. Is that what's troubling you, fella? Lift your head up high and take a walk in the sun with a dignity and stick-to-itiveness, and you show the world, to get off. You'll never give up, never give up, never give up. That ship. Hey there, friend. You say your radiators didn't work all winter, and now that it's summer, they started up again and you can't turn them off? You say your wife sent your lightweight suits to the cleaners, and that means you'll have to wear your itchy tweeds this morning when they say it'll hit 106? And you gotta meet an important businessman in an hour? And your bridge just broke and you pasted it together with bubble gum and you hope it don't fall apart while you're doing some fast talking to this man? And your shoelace just busted, and you open a big cut on your cheek trying to even out your sideburns, and your daughter's gone out with a convict, and your wife just confessed she gave you last $60 as a deposit on an airplane hangar. Is that what's troubling you, friend? Lift your head up high and take a walk in the sun with that dignity and stick-to-itiveness that you show the world. You show the world to get off. You'll never give up, never give up, never give up. That ship. Hey there, cousin. You say you can't pull your car out of the mud and you're in the middle of nowhere and it's pouring rain and you can't get the top back up and your paycheck's all blurred and your foot went right through the gas and your girl's screaming bloody murder. She's scared of the dark and a stroke of lightning splits your motor in half and your suit's shrinking up fast. And you start up the windy road on foot and 60 yards of barbed wire hits you right smack in the push. And your boat falls down in the mud and the wild animal comes over and runs away with your shoes. And and your car blows up suddenly and your windshield wiper ends up in your mouth and you can't move and the mud's rising up to your nostrils and you're sinking fast and you don't hear your girl screaming anymore? Is that what's on your mind, cousin? Well, lift your head up high and take a walk in the sun with that dignity and stick-to-itiveness and you show the world, you show the world to get off. You'll never give up, never give up, never give up. That ship. And now, this is the old philosopher saying, so long, folks.
I can't tell you how many times I did that shtick with some buddies when I was a kid, especially the part about the wild animal running away with the guy's shoes. I couldn't help but think about the old philosopher the other day when I was reading the following. You know it's going to be quite the day when your horoscope starts out, are you sitting down? You know it's going to be quite the day when you wake up in the hospital in traction and your insurance agent tells you that your accident policy covers falling off the roof but not hitting the ground. And I might add one more. You know it's going to be quite the day when your preacher says, wake up! Wake up! Quit hitting the snooze button even before you barely got yourself settled in your seat. But you know what? That's what the Apostle Paul is telling us today on this first Sunday of Advent. Let's listen again to what he has to say to us. He says, and do this, understanding the present time. For the hour has already come for you to wake up from your slumber, because our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. The night is nearly over. The day is almost here. You know, folks, I love the description that one church member gives about his pastor. The guy's name was Reverend Harry Rourke, and it seems that the good Reverend, he had a horse named Pastoral Calls. He kept it out at this church member's farm, and if you called the church office on Wednesdays, the secretary would tell you that the good Reverend wasn't in. He was out on pastoral calls. And so the church members, they came to know exactly what that meant, and yet it seems that Reverend Rourke also had some other interesting idiosyncrasies, one of which had to do with his preaching. And apparently, when he felt that his congregation wasn't paying attention, he'd stop, he would pause rather pregnantly, and he would say, are you listening? And at that, those who might be zoning out, maybe they were working on their grocery lists, or maybe they were doodling in their bulletins, they would tune back in. Because after all, everyone knew that when Dr. Rourke started asking that question, are you listening? That it was time to wake up. It was time to start tuning back in. So here we find ourselves on this first Sunday of a new church year, the first Sunday of Advent, the first Sunday of a new worship time for us. And I wonder, when you got up this morning, albeit a little bit earlier than you've had to get up for worship in the last months, when the alarm went off, was that a bad thing? Or was that a good thing? You know, some people, when they hear Paul's message to us today, a wake-up call, they interpret that, they hear that in a negative sense. Because, yeah, the world's going to hell in a handbasket, and so, yeah, you better wake up before it's too late, right? And certainly there's a time for that. For a lot of years of my ministry, I had the privilege of being able to work with AA groups. I'd often meet with guys who found themselves in need of a wake-up call. I like what New York Times columnist A.M. Rosenthal wrote. A while back, he wrote about drug addiction in America. And he said, you know, it's a familiar nightmare. And we've all had it. And the train's coming down the track at someone we love. And so you yell, you know, get out of the way. But sort of like a deer in the headlights, they don't move. And so you wake up all in a sweat. And maybe during this holiday season, you find yourself all in a sweat over somebody that you love, somebody who's in need of a wake-up call. Sort of like old comedian George Carlin. He talked about growing up with an Irish alcoholic father, and when George ended up battling his own addiction with drinking, he went to detox and he got all dried out, and Carlin said that he never forgot when he came back proud as a peacock, and he told his old man, I've beaten the beast. He never forgot what his old man said. He said, Georgie boy, you're sober. Fantastic. But there's still the marriage and the kids and the job to deal with. And yeah, the monkey may be off your back, but the circus is still in town. And ain't that the truth? As a lot of you know, Mike Mora from staff, he and I, in this interim period between youth pastors, we've been working with the youth group, and a few weeks ago, speaking of monkeys, speaking of beasties, we watched this cute little video about these two Christian teenagers. They're having a Coke, and as they talk about interesting things in their lives, but something obviously is going on off to the side, off camera. It's like this 800-pound gorilla is in the room. In fact, it literally is an 800-pound gorilla in the room. Because the one friend is trying to talk to his buddy lovingly about a growing problem that he sees spiraling out of control in his friend's life. And how it's sort of metaphorically portrayed throughout the video is this imaginary gorilla is following this kid around. And yeah, while talking to his buddy, all these banana peels keep getting thrown towards his friend's head. And his friend keeps insisting there's nothing wrong. So his mom, while cleaning his room, she finds this 6-pack beer bottle container. And instead of empty beer bottles in each of the slots, there's banana peels. And another time, as he puts down his video game controller, and having just finished a game to be able to do some homework, there's the gorilla pulling the video game controller out of his hands and making sure that he continues to play the video game and not do his homework. The next day, the teacher notices for the third time in a row that the kid hasn't handed in his homework. And when he asks a girl out that he likes, she tells him that she doesn't go out with guys involved with stuff like he's involved with. And when he asks her, what's that supposed to mean? After all, it's not like it has control over me or anything. As he says this, the imaginary gorilla has a hold of his arms, and he's waving his arms all over the place. No. This doesn't have any effect on me. And yet there are those times in our lives, aren't there, when we need a wake-up call, when something seemingly innocent and small, it starts to grow. And if it's not dealt with, it gets out of control. It's like one AA guy that I worked with for a while, and he told me, you know, Pastor, if I ever pick up a drink again, I don't have to worry, because somebody will come for me. All I have to look for is the guy dressed either in blue or white or black. That'll be the cop, blue. That'll be the EMT, white. That'll be the coroner, black. Yeah. There are a lot of folks who need a wake-up call because they're engaging, especially during this season, in self-destructing behaviors. And folks, here's the reality. The meaning behind the word Advent, the season that we are entering into, means coming. Not just Christ's coming at Christmas, but Christ's second coming, when he will come again to bring judgment. So yeah, Advent, it's a wake-up call. And it reminds us that judgment someday is coming. And the way our world and our country seems to be heading, yeah, it's getting closer and closer, isn't it? Yeah, the hour has come for you to wake up from your slumber, says Paul, because our salvation is near now than when we first believed. The night is nearly over. The day is at hand. Yeah, there's this train that is barreling down the tracks concerning the moral drift that's happening in our culture. Remember Germany 80 years ago? The vast majority of Germans were hitting the snooze button. They were slumbering on. Meanwhile, there's this 800-pound gorilla that's growing up right there in the room, and yet most, they continue to live in denial. But there were some faithful Christians who refused to snooze. And when the alarm went off, they didn't just keep hitting the pause button. And yet we remember the times were ripe for a guy like Adolf Hitler to rise to power. And just as then, so now, we who live in these times, we're going to need to be vigilant. These are interesting times in which we are living, aren't they? And I don't mean to be a fear-monger. I don't mean to be an alarmist, but the mortar's literally falling out between the bricks. So yeah, I'm concerned. And so is the Apostle Paul, where he continues on in today's lesson. So let us put aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light, and let us behave decently as in the daytime, not in carousing or in drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and debauchery, not in dissension and jealousy. And folks, Rome in Paul's day probably isn't that much different than America in our day, because people are people. And unless someone is sounding the alarm from time to time, society has the tendency to fall apart at the seams, to deteriorate, and to be pulled down by our own forces, our own sinful natures. Sure, Paul was warning the church at Rome not to hit the snooze button when it came to the pull of destructive pleasures. And isn't that what we do sometimes, even with our own good intentions? We're not quite ready to face the morning with all of its demands. So what do? We hit the snooze button. You know, a few years back, I read Eric Metaxas's landmark biography on the life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. German pastor during World War II, felt it was necessary to participate in a plot to kill Hitler. It was a matter of conscience. He was one of those Christians that I talked about earlier who refused to snooze. And one particular statement that he made struck me. He came to realize, and I quote, that mere confession or belief, no matter how courageous, inescapably means complicity with the murderers, in this case, the Nazis. As a result, Bonhoeffer couldn't just sit by and mouth these pious-sounding platitudes as millions were being killed. He had to act as a matter of conscience, and because of the cost associated with what he did, his choice, yeah, he ended up hanging at the end of a noose. You know, folks, according to USA Today, more than 1/3 of American adults hit the snooze button every morning, an average of 3 times. And the snooziest group, the 25 to 34-year-olds. The perkiest group, it's our seniors. Maybe that's because seniors have come to realize just how precious time is. Yeah. Isn't it time to wake up and to ask ourselves, what can we do during this Advent season? We can sit around and we can lament about society's evil. But how about doing something about them? The great Edmund Burke once said, the only thing required for the proliferation of evil is for good people to do what? Nothing. Bonhoeffer chose to do something. How about us? As you've heard tell already during this Advent season, we here at Community Church, we are seeking to work with a couple of projects with our friends over at Christian Neighbors. Our women's ministry is seeking to feed hungry children down in South Haven. And as 2017 will soon be upon us, I'll be challenging all of us to make a difference in the new year. Down in one of our old stomping grounds as a congregation, Pullman. Mike Mora, who you heard a moment ago with his wife up here, has spent a fair amount of time down there getting some feet on the ground and knowing the situation so that we can get a running start and in 2017 be able to do a number of mission projects in an area that's right out our own back door. Now, how about something I was talking about with some men at breakfast the other day? I'm going to be seeking in 2017 to put together what we're going to call a green team, a group of like-minded believers here at Community Church who recognize that the issue of climate change and global warming is not just a myth. It's not just a political football. It's just not for liberals or conservatives. This is a human problem. And we and our grandchildren and their grandchildren who have to call this planet that God has given us into our care, our home. Folks, it seems that when we heard God command us to take dominion of this earth, that we have interpreted it as go and dominate it, not be good stewards of a sacred trust. Yeah, in 2017, we're gonna talk about how we as a congregation in this area can make a difference and how we can wake up this church in our community from slumber as to the frightening reality that is facing us if we don't stop hitting the snooze button. Apostle Paul's words 2,000 years ago, they sound strangely contemporary. It is time for us to wake up from our slumber, for our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. The night is nearly over. The day is almost here. And friends, I don't want to sound like I'm going on a big harangue this morning and focus only on the negatives. Because actually, what the Apostle Paul is trying to say to us this morning is positive. This morning, he is talking to us about salvation coming into our midst during this season. It's the coming of light into a dark world. It's the preparing of our world for Christ's coming. And isn't that what Advent is all about? It's about the day of our salvation, when this broken world will be transformed and the kingdoms of this world will become the kingdom of our Christ. And sure, amidst the darkness of this world, we need to be reminded of that during this season, don't we? Once again, let's think back to World War II. It seems there was a POW ship. And it traveled from Java. And inside were 75 men who were battened down into the hatch of that ship as POWs. They had no blankets. They had little food. They had no room to lie down. For 3 months, they couldn't tell whether it was night or day. And of those 75 men, roughly a third, only 26 survived until the day that the engine stopped. And promptly they were herded out of that ship. Their eyes were blinded up on deck into the light. They were marched down that gangplank, not knowing what month it was. They were pushed into a concrete cell, God only knows where. They expected to die at any minute, and yet night came. And suddenly they heard the sounds of bells from a nearby Christian monastery. And at that, they threw their arms around each other and they wept like little children because the bells told them it was Christmas Day. And just like our friend old Ebenezer Scrooge, that day they found their faith again. And friends, amidst the darkness of this world, I hope that you here today, as you will hear the bells of Christmas in the days ahead, that your faith will be renewed in the midst of this darkness. For just as Paul told us, the key to being prepared for God's salvation this season is this. Let's listen again to what Paul says. Clothe yourselves with the Lord Jesus Christ, and do not think about how to gratify the desires of your sinful nature. Yeah. Clothe yourselves this season with Christ. As we wrap up, I like what Pastor Ron Hall has to say. He says, perhaps like that life group you heard about, you've gone out to get a Christmas tree late in the holiday season. There wasn't much left, so you ended up getting a Charlie Brown tree. Oh well, you thought, maybe you could hide the bare spots in the corner, you could make do. So you started to decorate the strings of light, the ornaments, the tinsel. And when you turn on the lights, wow, everyone is hushed by the transformation. And God's grace, Pastor Hall says, is like that. It picks us up out of the scrap heap, and then it covers us with the robe of righteousness, and it presents us spotless before God, magnificent in the splendor of the gift that he has given, and sparkling in the light of his love. Folks, that's what it means to be clothed with Christ. Maybe as Pastor Rourke said, I might ask you this morning, are you listening? I invite you this Advent season to fall in love with Jesus all over again, to quit hitting the snooze button. Get dressed. Clothe yourselves with Christ so that you might rediscover the joy of your salvation. Or as the old philosopher, St. Paul reminds us, is the 800-pound gorilla already sitting in the room? But wake up! Wake up! Wake up! And get that beast off your back. Clothe yourselves instead this season with Christ. Let's pray. Father, we don't need an old philosopher to tell us that sometimes we are living in the darkness. We thank you for the good news of this season as we prepare for Christmas, for Advent, that you are coming, that you are coming again, that when you come, for those who know your name and clothe yourselves with Christ, that awaiting for us is the greatest news of all. Come this Christmas, renew our hope